Good evening. On behalf of the Acton 250 Committee, it will be my pleasure in a few moments to reintroduce Professor Robert Allison, who has graciously agreed to return after having initiated our series of lectures last September. At that point, we intended to structure a countdown to April 19th, 1775. Bob, you could not have done a better job launching us by encapsulating the crucial year of 1773, ending with the destruction of the tea. Nor could we have anticipated the loyalty of the audience, which reappears on a regular basis, not unlike the Boston town meeting attendees of the 1770s.
I'm getting up to speak, so I won't.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I'm in your way.
Forgive my ignorance.
No. I should have
Okay,
let
here
you
we go.
let you get in.
One of the biggest surprises of that first evening and each that followed has been the large contingent of ABRHS students who have attended and followed the talks attentively, primarily sophomores. You will move on to US 2 next year to be replaced by a fresh crop of US 1 students. It is the committee's hope that you will remain alert to the celebrations next year and remember this as a special time in your life. May I hear a round of applause for the tenacity of our students and for the teachers who have inspired them to be active participants in our countdown. Before we resume, let's take stock of the resources we have assembled and the plans for the coming months. Please remember that the Acton 250 events website displays descriptions of and links to the previous talks and book discussions. It reads vertically with a link to Acton 250 merchandise, which you can see on the back table, and the most recent events at the top, cascading all the way down to Professor Allison's first lecture. During these warm months, attention is now shifting to Still Here, Houses of Our Patriots, with an open house last Sunday at the Jones Tavern and the Faulkner House, a June 10th discussion of the Edwards House in North Acton, and an open house at the Hosmer House on July 7th. Amy Cole, can you wave? Amy Cole, all right, has curated a tour of Acton Center, repeated several times and likely to do so again. We appreciate the publicity currently appearing in Action Unlimited, Marian Maxwell's emails, and the Acton Exchange. A series of lectures are planned for the fall, highlighted by a return visit by Mary Fuhrer, who's with us this evening, to understand the context for Acton's unique experience, which came to be called Crowned Resistance Day, and historian Bob Gross, whose book, The Minutemen, has stood the test of time since 1975. Having considered the role of newspapers, we will focus then on taverns, where they were likely to have been read. Keep your eyes open for further updates. Professor Allison is surely having two of the busiest years of his professional life. Renowned as an expert on colonial Boston, he now chairs Revolution 250, the Massachusetts Consortium of organizations holding commemorations statewide. We could not have had a better guide to the 18th century, which Joseph J. Ellis describes as the country we need to visit, and specifically Mary Beth Norton's long year of 1774. The empire strikes back, resistance becomes revolution, positions us right back where you left us as the tension, turmoil, and complexity of that year increases. May we give a warm return welcome to Professor Allison.
Well, thank you very much, Pam, and thank you all for joining us this evening for more on what was leading to the revolution. And let me say how impressed I've been with what the town of Acton is doing, not only inviting me here to speak, but the community getting engaged and how great it is to see young people here who are, we won't be here for the 300th anniversary of independence, but you will be. So this will be your mission to carry this on over the next half century and beyond. So thank you for beginning now. And 1774 really is the year that the revolution begins. And it does owe to the events of 1773, which, as Pam said, I spoke to you about a year or so ago. And it's really a time of people making choices. In London, Thomas Gage, who was the commander of British military forces in North America, and he had been based in New York for most of the 1770s. He will come to Massachusetts in June of 1774 as the governor of Massachusetts. But Gage in London said that people talk more seriously than ever about America. That crisis has come when the provinces must either be British colonies or independent and separate states. What will be done, nobody, I believe, can yet tell. So Gage knew that there was a crisis reached, and he was not sure what the outcome would be. And in Boston, Reverend John Lathrop, who was the pastor of the Second Church, speculated on how 50 years later, that is in 1824, people would look back on this era, and would their local differences and jealousies make united efforts impossible? Or would the colonists hold a Congress and embark on a quiet and peaceful suspension of trade? For life and death, he said, in a political sense, are now set before us, and the fate of America for many generations depends on the virtue of her sons and daughters in the present day. So he sees also a crisis and a choice the people were making, and also the great difficulty of having Americans learn to work together. He wasn't thinking grandly of Americans, he was actually thinking of people in Massachusetts who often don't get along for a variety of what he saw as petty reasons in the light of this crisis. One of the real profound moments of choice comes in January of 1774 at the Privy Council. Last time I was here, and typically when I see a group of students, I will ask them what I said in the last class and see what they remember. You weren't here you missed the last class. 1773, the big crisis was over letters that Thomas Hutchinson, the governor, had written, and he had sent to a political figure in London. That political figure died. For those of you who do remember last time, you'll see if I'm getting all of this right. And the letters came into the hands of Benjamin Franklin, who sent them to the Massachusetts Assembly, which then ruins Thomas Hutchinson's career in Massachusetts, because he is talking about the Assembly behind their backs. And what the Assembly wanted was to have Hutchinson replaced by a governor with whom they could get along better, a governor who would be more pliable to their wishes. Hutchinson was not that man. He had been appointed governor in 1770 because they thought he could get along with these people, because he's one of them. Hutchinson was from here. Hutchinson's ancestors had come to Boston in the 1630s. He was writing a history of Massachusetts. He had not lived anywhere else. So he is one of these people. Can't he get along with them? And the answer was no. And in 1773, when the Assembly realized they can't get along with Hutchinson, they asked their agent in London, Benjamin Franklin, to get Hutchinson recalled and replaced with someone more pliable. So in the middle of 1773, Benjamin Franklin had arranged for the Privy Council to look into the case of Massachusetts versus Thomas Hutchinson. Of course, the Privy Council, this is a group of advisors to the Crown, have a lot of things on their agenda more important than what's happening in Massachusetts. Of course, we here in Massachusetts know that the world is always watching us, waiting for us to make some choice which they then will follow. Not only Massachusetts as a commonwealth, but each town of Massachusetts believes all eyes are focused on what is happening in this particular town. And those of you familiar with, say, Concord or Boxborough know how those people are about focusing on parochial local interests. So the Privy Council schedules their hearing, which Franklin had requested in June of 1773, in January of 1774. And usually Privy Council meetings are, like most government meetings, stale, dull. They attract only those who have to attend. This meeting was packed. The Prime Minister could not find a seat. He is standing in the back along with Jeremy Bentham. He's a who's who of London society who turn out for the Privy Council hearing because they know it is going to be a great spectacle. And it's not a great spectacle because Benjamin Franklin is going to be speaking. Franklin, in fact, does not say a word. It's a great spectacle because the Solicitor General of the Empire, Alexander Wedderburn, who is a Scotsman, spends an hour and a half talking about this crisis brewing with the colonies and the reason for the crisis. And the reason for the crisis, he says, is quite simple. It is that man, Benjamin Franklin. Mark that man, he says. Franklin, he had brought on this crisis, and Franklin, he says, is not content with being here as the agent of a provincial assembly. He imagines himself the ambassador of an independent empire. And he had brought on this crisis by stealing letters which did not belong to him and using them to ruin the reputation of one of His Majesty's faithful servants. He will hereafter cringe at being called a man of letters. He has proven himself to be nothing more than a common thief. No one will trust his personal effects around this man. And Franklin stood there listening as Wedderburn blamed everything on him, accused him of being a common thief and other things. By the way, these are the kinds of words that might cause one man to challenge another one to a duel. And what Franklin was really seeing was the audience was enjoying it. Wedderburn was a brilliant speaker, and people enjoyed the spectacle of Wedderburn taking this provincial American down a few pegs. The great Dr. Franklin, the most celebrated American of his day, is now being mocked before the Privy Council, before British society. And Franklin's looking around the room at faces he knew well. He was a member of the same clubs as many of these people, and they were enjoying the spectacle. Franklin had come into the room having arranged the hearing, hoping that by this meeting we could get rid of Thomas Hutchinson, and by doing so, save the empire, and he leaves the room not thinking that the empire is worth saving. So this is one of these critical moments in early 1774 when Franklin is marked as the instigator of all of this. Now, what Wedderburn was trying to do was actually defend Thomas Hutchinson. the able governor of Massachusetts. And here you see the Massachusetts Almanac for 1774 with Paul Revere's woodcut on the cover of the wicked statesman or traitor to his country, in case you don't get who Hutchinson is, in the hour of his death. And you can see death is about to spear Thomas Hutchinson as the devil stands over him holding a list of his crimes, and below looks like an alligator. It's actually the jaws of hell about to open up to receive Thomas Hutchinson. His reputation was ruined here in Massachusetts, and Wedderburn is trying to save it. And for his part, Hutchinson very much wanted to leave Boston and go to London where he could plead his case and try to salvage his reputation. The one thing that prevents him from leaving is the death of his brother-in-law, Andrew Oliver, I'm sorry. This is Peter Oliver. We'll get back to Oliver in a moment. His brother-in-law dies. His brother-in-law is the lieutenant governor. And Hutchinson knows if he leaves Massachusetts, there won't be a lieutenant governor. The assembly then will be running things. He does not want to leave Massachusetts in the hands of his enemies in the assembly. Now, there's another big issue here, a big issue which had precipitated much of this trouble, and that is, what will we pay the judges in Massachusetts? Back in 1770, did I talk about this last time? Some people are saying, yes, I did talk about 1770. Okay. So Parliament was the Crown was going to pay judges in Massachusetts. And this all is coming to a head here in 1774, and every judge in Massachusetts, under great pressure from the, for want of a better word, we'll call them the people, who showed their displeasure with the judges by surrounding the courthouses and telling them they could not actually hold court unless they renounced their salary from the Crown. And every judge in Massachusetts agreed with that except one, and that is Peter Oliver. Peter Oliver is the brother of Andrew Oliver, the late lieutenant governor. And in fact, when Andrew Oliver died on March the 3rd of 1774, Peter Oliver could not go to his funeral. He was told his safety could not be guaranteed. He could not attend his brother's funeral because people were mad at him because he was going to accept a crown salary. And this is what precipitates his impeachment by the Massachusetts Assembly. Now, there are the big stories here. Back in the Assembly, every judge says, hey, I'm not going to take the salary. Did I really tell you this last year and you remember this? Oh, no, now you're saying no. Pam is saying yes. Pam hangs on my every word. It's really, I think, understanding this political context of what makes the revolution happen, it's somewhat tedious because a lot of it seems like mundane political affairs. It's not quite as exciting as marching to Concord Bridge and firing at the British troops. But it really is something happening in the minds of people here as they're determining how they will be governed. And here you have Hutchinson and the British government and Peter Oliver saying we govern according to a charter and according to these rules. And then in Massachusetts, a different order of government is emerging, where individuals are making a choice about whether they will obey or not obey the established government. So this is what's happening here. John Adams, a member of the Assembly, proposes impeaching Judge Oliver. The problem is that the Assembly had never impeached a Crown official before, and the Assembly does, and nothing happens because, according to Governor Hutchinson, the Assembly does not have this power. So this is some of the context here. What's happening in the meantime is every other judge in Massachusetts is agreeing not to accept the salary and thus can go on with his life and his judgeship. So we still have this Massachusetts not wanting to adhere to the rule by Parliament, but it's unclear what Massachusetts will do. On the other hand, it's quite clear what Parliament is going to do. Parliament in 1774 begins passing a series of measures to bring Massachusetts into line. The first of these is the Boston Port Act. This is in response to the temerity Boston showed in allowing for the cargoes of East India tea to be destroyed in December of 1773. By the way, news of the destruction of the tea had reached London just a day or two before Franklin's hearing before the Privy Council. And Parliament in March of 1774 shuts down the port of Boston, and it will remain closed until Boston repays the East India Company for the tea Boston has destroyed. This is a serious measure, and of course, one thing Parliament believes, if Salem becomes the primary port of Boston, won't that be good news for Salem? Well, Salem really winced because Boston is shut down. Or for that matter, will New York, or Philadelphia, or Charleston, South Carolina. Other ports are going to enjoy a boom now that Boston is being taught a lesson. So this is a real danger for Boston, not that everything revolves around what's dangerous or good for Boston, that this will isolate Boston as the source of the trouble and thus contain the trouble. And in response to the Boston Port Bill, Josiah Quincy, who is a lawyer in Boston, one of the guys who had defended the British troops in 1770, Quincy's nickname, by the way, is the Patriot. He writes very quickly a pamphlet on observations on the Act of Parliament, commonly called the Boston Port Bill. And the problem with the Port Bill for Quincy wasn't just Boston is going to starve or Boston's trade is going to be cut. The real problem with the Boston Port Bill, Quincy said, is it's establishing military force in a civilian town. It's also setting up an arbitrary government here, punishing the guilty along with the innocent. That is, not all Bostonians were involved in the destruction of the tea. Also, he points out that the East India Company had not asked for any compensation for the tea that had been destroyed. And also, he says, according to the Massachusetts Charter, it is illegal for a town to appropriate money except for necessary town expenses. That's probably still true. The town can't simply appropriate money for things that aren't necessary to the town, and certainly it's not necessary for the taxpayers of Boston to be compensating the largest corporation in the world. So Quincy's argument against the Boston Port Act isn't that this hurts Boston, it's that it's a fundamental assault on the idea of liberty and the idea that people in a community can govern themselves. And the pamphlet circulates throughout the colonies as well as in London, as we will see. And this is actually a London engraving showing the Boston Port Act. You can see this gentleman who is pouring tea down Boston's throat has the Boston Port Bill in his pocket, and there's another fellow looking up poor Boston's dress, and this is the British reaction to the Boston Port Bill. In Virginia, the Virginia House of Burgesses meets, and they call for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer in support of Boston. This leads the governor, actually George Washington and George Mason are among the drafters of this call for Virginia to support Boston in her moment of distress. This leads the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, to suspend the assembly, and the assembly, it goes across the street to Raleigh Tavern to continue meeting, and there they call for a convention of Virginians to meet in August to decide how Virginia will side with Boston in this moment of distress. And back in Fairfax County, Washington and Mason draft a document called the Fairfax Resolves, which also call for Virginia to support Boston in this moment of crisis. Here in Massachusetts, the Assembly meets, and they're meeting up in Salem, and as the Assembly is meeting, choosing delegates to go to a Continental Congress, which Virginia had called for, the new governor Thomas Gage announces that the assembly is being suspended. Nonetheless, they choose these 5 worthy gentlemen to go to Philadelphia as part of this Congress. Should I ask you who these are?
John Adams.
Which is John Adams?
Lower left.
Okay. Someone other than Mr. Collins. Samuel Adams. No one ever called him Sam, by the way. If you were married to him, you might call him Samuel. Otherwise, he would be Mr. Adams to us. He was not the happy guy that, at least you folks have seen on beer bottles. You have not seen these beer bottles. Yes. Robert Treat Paine, John Hancock, and Thomas Cushing. Meanwhile, Parliament passes a series of other acts. Actually, this is Thomas Gage, who's going to arrive in Boston in May to become the governor. And with General Gage comes another act of Parliament, the Massachusetts Government Act. Actually, you can see it's an act for the better regulating the government in the province of Massachusetts Bay. It's always interesting to see how we name pieces of legislation. Who could possibly be against a better regulation of the government of Massachusetts? This essentially takes the power of government out of the hands of the people of the towns of Massachusetts. Previously, towns had been governed by the town meeting that met whenever 10 of their men, tax-paying men, called for a meeting. And whatever that meeting decided was the law in the town. The town meeting also chose all of the local officials, the tax collectors, the sheriffs, the magistrates, the fence inspectors, the hog reeves. You might not have realized that this is an important position, but if you live in a town where hogs are running wild, you'll want someone to wrangle the hogs. And typically, newly married men would be appointed hog reeve. That might be your first position in the town. Was it the case with, and if you prove yourself good at reeving the hogs, they might give you another responsibility. So all of these offices were in the power of the town to appoint. And now they are not. The governor now will appoint all of these officials. A town can only have one meeting a year, and they have to ask the governor's permission to hold the meeting. They have to tell the governor what it is they are going to be discussing, and the governor will likely disapprove of this attempt by the town to meet. So the Massachusetts Government Act takes the power of governing out of the hands of the people in the towns and puts it firmly in the hands of Governor Gage. This is a way of stamping out this movement of self-government, which had been operating in Massachusetts since the 17th century. So the Government Act also allows the governor to appoint counselors. There was a council appointed by the assembly. The governor could approve or veto the members of the council the assembly had chosen, but now it's simply up to the governor to choose the counselors. And Governor Gage does choose counselors. He actually has trouble finding them. He's supposed to appoint 35. After about a month, he's only found fewer than 20 who are willing to serve. They know the mood of their neighbors. And in fact, some of those who do elect to serve, for example, Timothy Paine of Worcester. We don't have an image of Mr. Paine. He doesn't stay around long enough to have a portrait done. He's one of the leading citizens of Worcester. He had been elected to the assembly. He had served on the governor's council. He's someone well known to everyone in Worcester, and he is forced to resign. Actually, the leader of the Worcester Committee of Correspondence is a fellow named Timothy Bigelow, and Bigelow is also the commander of the local militia. He and Paine knew each other very well. They had served together on committees. And now Paine has Bigelow arriving at his house with several hundred members of the Worcester militia, and Bigelow comes inside and says, "You have to resign." I don't know what you would say if several hundred guys show up and say, "You have to resign." What would you say? You would be speechless. I'm sure that's what Mr. Paine was at first, but we want you to say something. Are you going to say, yes, I'm going to be a counselor, or no, I'm going to adhere to what my constituents want, what my neighbors want? Yeah. Okay. So that's what he says. And so Bigelow goes outside and tells the militia he's resigned. And they say, that's not good enough. We have to hear him resign. So Bigelow comes outside and he says, I resign. They say, no, you have to write it down. We want it in writing. So he writes out a letter of resignation. Payne comes out with Bigelow, and Bigelow says, here is his letter of resignation. They say, we want to hear him read it. So he starts reading this letter. We can't hear you. There are now about 1,000 people in front of his house waiting for him to read his letter of resignation, and they can't hear him. He's not a young man. When I was younger, I would tell the story. He would say he was an elderly man, but now that I'm older than he was, I'll say, well, he's not a young man. He reads it as the members of the militia march past him, and he has to keep reading it until they've all heard all of it. This is an extraordinary humiliation of one of the leading citizens of the town who had the temerity to agree to serve in a public capacity. And then the militia goes to other towns. And Colonel John Murray, again, he has been a colonel in the militia. He's a well-known citizen. As you can see, he's a fairly prosperous citizen, is also forced to resign. And Daniel Leonard of Taunton. And Leonard was a lawyer, and he had written a series of essays published in the newspapers back a year or so earlier with the pen name Massachusetts. And he was actually writing in response to John Adams, who was writing a series of essays under the pen name Novanglis. And Leonard lives down in Taunton, and he has to leave Taunton because his neighbors, upset that he's accepted a position on the council, attack his house and begin dismantling his house, forcing him to flee to Boston for his safety. And Gage sees the way things are going here in Massachusetts. He knows that the towns are stockpiling weapons and ammunition, and so he wants to prevent bloodshed by disarming the people of Massachusetts, which seems like a good precaution. And in early September, he orders troops to go to what's now Medford, where there's a powder house outside of town, stone structure outside of town where you store powder, gunpowder. And there are several barrels of gunpowder there which belong to the province. It's always a big issue. Does the powder belong to the town or to the province? These particular barrels of powder, Gage says, belong to the province, so we'll take it under safekeeping. So a group of British troops go up to Medford, take the powder, get it into boats, take it back down to Castle William to put it under safekeeping. The next day, word has spread. This is Gage, who had pulled off the taking of the powder. The next day, word had spread. This is before Twitter, before X, even before X. And word had spread, not only had Gage taken the powder, but in taking it, several valiant folks who had resisted were killed, which wasn't true. But rumors spread, even without the help of social media. And the next day, several thousand people gather on Cambridge Common. The militia of Middlesex County gather to go into Boston to get the powder back. Now, also living in Cambridge at the time was this Thomas Oliver. And Thomas Oliver, actually surprising to Mr. Oliver, Gage had appointed him lieutenant governor. Oliver didn't ask for the job. He didn't even know he was going to get the job. Gage had arrived, knew he needed a lieutenant governor, and then had a short list of people who might accept the job if he asked. And one was Mr. Oliver, who had only been lieutenant governor for about a month. And now he's living in Cambridge, minding his own business, except for being lieutenant governor, when several thousand people gather on Cambridge Common, just a few blocks from his house, and they're going to go march into Boston to seize the powder. Oliver knows that's going to be a big mistake. So Oliver goes into Boston to tell Gage, don't send any troops out to Cambridge, and maybe you should give the powder back. Gage says, no, we're not going to give the powder back, but yeah, we don't want to cause a war, so we won't send troops out. Oliver goes back to Cambridge and tells the militia gathered there, they're not going to do anything. Let's not march into Boston because that would be a disaster for everybody. But before Oliver gets back, the mob has gone to find other targets, and also living nearby is a judge, Thomas Danforth, man in his late 70s. The mob goes and surrounds his house and tells him he better resign as a judge. And what do you think he does? He doesn't say no. He does resign as a judge. See, you're young. You would say no to the mob. And as the mob is deliberating with Judge Danforth, a couple of other, members of the Massachusetts elite happen to come through Cambridge. Benjamin Hallowell and Joseph Lee, other worthies, and actually riding through Cambridge in their carriages. They're convenient targets now for this mob. They didn't know this was happening in Cambridge. Not much of an interest ever does happen in Cambridge. They were just going through on their way back to Roxbury or Boston where they lived, and suddenly they have several thousand people who are really angry with the fact that these guys are serving in the provincial, not in the provincial council, or they are customs commissioners. And in fact, this fellow, Hallowell, is a customs commissioner. He realizes his carriage isn't fast enough to get away from the mob, so he gets out of the carriage, pushes his servant off of his horse so he can ride into Boston ahead of this mob trying to catch him. And he does get into Boston just fast enough, but then can't leave. One of the things we see happening here is that those who are either part of the government apparatus of General Gage or those who want to remain part of the empire find the towns they have lived in for their entire lives are no longer safe for them. So this is the big change happening. And then for good measure, the crowd goes to Lieutenant Governor Oliver's house and convinces him that he should resign as lieutenant governor. So by the end of the day of September 2nd of 1774, you have seen a forcing of people holding office under the provincial government. The government of the Massachusetts Government Act can no longer hold office under the Massachusetts government, forced out of office by an angry populace. 4,000 men surrounded Oliver's house when he opted to give up his position as lieutenant governor. Now, at the same time this is happening, General Gage had said you cannot have town meetings. So what these crafty folks in Massachusetts do is start having county meetings, a county convention. So you can't have a town meeting in Boston. Well, we'll have a Suffolk County Convention. It actually meets in Milton, presided over by Joseph Warren. And they draw up a series of resolutions which then are sent to the Congress that's meeting in Philadelphia. By the way, another of the acts Parliament has passed, as Parliament is trying to rein all of this in, is an act for the impartial administration of justice. And this one calls for judges actually to be paid by the Crown and also to have people accused of crimes in the colonies transported to England, where they can be tried by a jury which won't be susceptible to the whims of these mobs. It seems like a wise precaution not to have these mobs who are forcing counselors to resign, forcing judges to give up their salaries, have malcontents and other abusers of the king's peace brought to London for trial instead of having them tried here in Massachusetts. And what happens in Massachusetts is somewhat predictable. Well, maybe it's predictable. When the courts assemble, the judges are forced by large gatherings to disavow the Administration of Justice Act, essentially to declare Massachusetts's judicial independence from the British Crown. The story is in Barnstable on Cape Cod, then actually, the Chief Justice in Barnstable was James Otis Sr., the gentleman on the right, the father of James Otis, the lawyer, Mercy Otis Warren, the writer, and other Otises. So he's a respected figure here. His children are firmly patriots. He is the chief judge, and he is also being called to account just as some of these Tory officials were being called to account. Nathaniel Freeman of, I believe, Sandwich or Yarmouth, leads his delegation to the Barnstable court, and Otis tells Freeman and this mob who have assembled in his courtroom, "It is my duty to tell you to disperse." And Freeman says, "You have done your duty, Your Honor. We will continue to do ours," which is not to disperse, but to put pressure on Barnstable County's court not to meet, which it doesn't. Similar things happen in other parts of the Commonwealth. This is the Plymouth County Court. Actually, the courthouse building had been put up by Peter Oliver back in the 1740s. And the Plymouth Court, not only does the Plymouth Court not get to meet, but some of the citizens of Plymouth think this would be a good moment to take the Plymouth Rock. Has anyone seen Plymouth Rock, by the way? It's a pebble. Yeah, some of you have seen it. Is it an impressive thing? No. Okay. They try to bring Plymouth Rock from the beach to put in front of the courthouse. They're trying to draw a connection between what we're doing and what those folks who stepped off the Mayflower back in 1620 were doing. In doing so, actually, the rock splits. And so they put a piece of it in front of the Plymouth courthouse later on, I think for the centennial of American independence, I think they put it back together. That's a story for another day. So Plymouth Rock has moved. In Taunton, they draw up this wonderful flag, the Liberty and Union flag, and you see other acts of resistance. In Worcester, you actually have hundreds of people from the surrounding towns going to Worcester. This is the list of those who in September 1774 went to Worcester to prevent the meeting of the courts. Look at this. The town of Sutton. Has anyone been to Sutton? 500 men from Sutton marched to Worcester. I was being told this by the state senator from Sutton. He says, "I don't think there are 500 men in Sutton today." But in 1774, 500 of them are marching on Worcester to prevent the courts from sitting. And the Worcester resolves say that the various acts of Parliament, which are called by Parliament the coercive acts, because they're trying to coerce these colonies or Massachusetts back into a state of a more acquiescent state. Here in Massachusetts, they're called the intolerable acts. If these acts are not repealed, the people of Worcester say, we are in a state of nature because of the dissolution of our old Constitution, that is the Massachusetts Charter of 1691. In a new government, the people in Worcester say, all officers shall be dependent on the suffrages of the people for their existence. And the only alternative to this is a state of either anarchy or slavery. So what Worcester is proposing is not either anarchy and certainly not slavery, but a system where all offices are dependent on the votes of the people. You really see a change happening here in the thinking of people about how they will be governed. They're working this out as they're shutting down the courts and doing other things, which those who are upholders of the standing order would call actually an affront to the very idea of any kind of established government. Okay. Another thing that happens here in Massachusetts is this. Gage actually there had been elections for an assembly in the summer, and Gage called for the assembly to convene in Salem early in October. And then Gage realizes having the assembly meet at all might be a mistake. So in late September, he repealed the order for the assembly to meet. Now, the members of the assembly claim they never got that repeal. They show up in Salem, and the governor, having told them not to meet, doesn't come. So the members of the assembly say, well, we're here because the governor called us. The governor didn't show up. Well, we'll continue meeting, not as the assembly, but as a provincial congress. And after a couple of days of sitting in Salem, they move to Concord, actually to the first meeting house in Concord. And they have their committee meetings in the Wright Tavern next door. And this body becomes the effective government of Massachusetts. This is the assembly elected by the town meetings back in 1774, early in 1774, before the governor said you can't have a meeting unless I say so, and now they meet as a provincial congress. In Concord, you have Gage in Salem, and then in Boston, operating under a charter he has from the Crown to govern Massachusetts, and you have the Massachusetts Provincial Congress meeting in Concord, essentially saying we are the government of Massachusetts. And Gage writes a letter to London explaining why he thought it would be a big mistake to try to have a meeting in Salem. The members of the council, of the Mandamus Council, those who had agreed to continue serving, realized it's not safe for them to be in Salem. They have to be in Boston, where they'll be under the protection of Gage and the troops. So this is a choice that's going on in Massachusetts. It would be nice if we could point to a particular day when this happens, but it's happening over the year of 1774 as Parliament is pushing this issue of government here by suspending the Massachusetts government and by suspending the traditions of justice, whereby you'll be tried by a jury of your peers, and this is the abrogation of that standing idea about justice is also a violation of the Magna Carta, and closing the Port of Boston, other things which Massachusetts folks and the folks in other colonies are agreeing are an affront to their ideas about how they will be governed. And the Congress meets in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774, and that's probably a story for another day. As you can see, there's lots to be said about what's happening in Congress, but I will spare you that. Let me just tell you another thing, because this is a story, here in Massachusetts, we do tell the story as very Massachusetts-centric. And I don't know, even if those of you who have had the benefit of going to the schools here in Acton know this. In 1908, the Congress of the United States designated the first battle of the American Revolution. And does anyone know what the first battle of the American Revolution was according to the Congress of the United States? No, I don't want you to look at the screen. What do you know? Where did it happen?
Well, it's always been Lexington.
It's always been Lexington and Concord until 1908, when Congress said it actually was in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. West Virginia, yes. In September of 1774, there was a battle. Is anyone here from West Virginia and know much more about this? Suddenly, no one wants to admit that there. At this time, yeah, okay, yes, Mr. Collins. In 1774, there was no West Virginia. It was the western part of Virginia, and in 1861, it becomes the state of West Virginia. That's really a story for another day, and I know most folks in Massachusetts don't think much about what's happening in far-flung places like Albany or West Virginia or other places that are way out west somewhere, well beyond Worcester. In 1774, there was a battle in what is now West Virginia on the Ohio River between the Virginia militia, led by Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, and other worthies. Cornstalk was the leader of the Shawnee, and the Shawnee Confederation in what is today Ohio were resisting encroachments by Virginians into the Ohio country, and Dunmore leads the West Virginia forces out to Ohio, and in September of 1774, they fight a battle at Point Pleasant on the Kanawha River, and where it joins the Ohio. And this is Andrew Lewis, he's the gentleman in the middle, who's the leader of the Virginia militia. I think that's Slow Turtle is the other fellow here. Anyway, it has nothing at all to do with the American Revolution. It's a war between native people and Virginians, happens before the Revolution, and this is actually a good lesson for those who are studying history. One thing happens before another thing. It doesn't mean that thing caused the other thing. So 1908, though, Congress said this was the first battle of the American Revolution. And I'm not here, by the way, to run down West Virginia's claim to its historical importance. It's a wonderful place. I invite you and encourage you to visit. Actually, the first weekend in September, which happens to coincide with the Battle of Point Pleasant, also turns out is a Mothman festival. In the two big things happened in Point Pleasant. One was a battle in 1774, and I know I'm well off the subject now, Bob and Pam, so I apologize for this. In the 1970s, a bridge over the Ohio River collapsed, and it was a tragedy. Many people were killed, but there was apparently a closed mental institution nearby, and from the mental institution, someone said, a large Mothman figure emerged and was either pulling people out of the water or causing the bridge to collapse. I was a little hazy on this. I believe there's a film with John Travolta which tells the story. I've not yet had a chance to see the film. Have you seen this film? Have you seen the film? Okay. I invite, here's your speaker next time. Mothman. It's called Mothman? Mothman. John Travolta. Okay. Well, he'll tell you later. Apparently, it's also a big goth festival. So I don't know if you're familiar with this particular culture, but yeah, okay. So anyway, yeah. So Point Pleasant, West Virginia, according to Congress, first battle of the American Revolution. My question when I'm thinking about this isn't why. In fact, the West Virginia state historian said this has nothing at all to do with the Revolution. I don't know if he kept his position as state historian very long, but I give him real credit for this. My real question is, Massachusetts' senator in 1908 happened to have a PhD in history from Harvard, and he wrote books of history. Where was he? Where was the member of Congress from this area then? I don't know. Okay, another thing happens in the fall of 1774, which is a fellow named Stewart from Baltimore is bringing his ship called the Peggy Lee into the Chesapeake Bay, and his neighbors say, you cannot, Peggy Stewart, Anthony Stewart is the owner, it's not the Peggy Lee, it's the Peggy Stewart, it's carrying tea. He says it's not East India tea, it's tea that hasn't been taxed. And his neighbors say, you can't bring tea in here. So in order to show them he's not smuggling tea, he sets his ship on fire. This is in Annapolis. In fact, there's a painting of this in the Maryland State House. So in Maryland, They not only don't want the tea, they don't want anyone bringing in the tea, and in order to show you're not bringing in the tea, you have to set your own ship on fire. And I think one thing other towns might look for in commemorative activities is burning of ships, because this is, okay. So let's talk a little bit now. Let's go back to London, where we began. It seems like several hours ago. Franklin stays in London after his humiliation at the Privy Council. He is trying to work with members of the British opposition. There's an election for Parliament in the fall of 1774, and there is some thinking that maybe if the opposition wins, they can change the North Ministry's policy on America and avert a war, which we know will be disastrous for everybody. So Franklin is there, and Josiah Quincy arrives. Quincy, who had written the observations on the Boston Port Bill. And Quincy is also there to try to engage with British opposition figures. And Quincy also meets with Lord North. He spends 2 hours with Lord North, who wants to know what Quincy thinks about what's happening. It's pretty clear, since Lord North has on his desk a copy of the observations on the Boston Port Bill. The Quincy says the one problem he has in the interview with Lord North, North is a great politician. And one thing a great politician is able to do is talk to you and make you think he actually agrees with you. Another problem Quincy has is Lord North also, as a longtime politician, likes to talk, likes the sound of his own voice. And you're probably saying, why am I seeming to criticize someone who likes the sound of his own voice? And Quincy also likes the sound of his own voice, so it's not quite clear if either one actually heard what the other was saying. And Quincy also meets with Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State for American Affairs. And Dartmouth also has read Quincy's observations on the Boston Port Bill. And Quincy says everything seemed to go along well with Dartmouth and North, but then at some point after he met with them, Thomas Hutchinson, who had arrived in London also in the summer of 1774, goes to meet with North and Dartmouth and says, don't listen to what these guys are saying. So Quincy is meeting with British officials, and he gets a warmer welcome from North and Dartmouth than he might have expected. What really surprises Quincy, though, isn't his reception by the leaders of the British government so much as his reception by ordinary Britons. Because what he had heard was the British public was fed up with the Americans, particularly the people in Massachusetts, with their petty grievances, their constant complaining, their inability to get along, and the destruction of the tea was the last straw. What he finds instead is that people, the ordinary citizens of England, or the ordinary subjects, I should say, want the Americans to win this. If liberty is extinguished in America, it will be extinguished in England. If liberty dies there, it dies here. The cause of America, Quincy reports back, is the cause of liberty. And the ordinary subjects in London recognize this. We must look to America with infinite anxiety, someone says. 'Tis America only can save England. We're afraid of nothing but your division and your want of perseverance. Unite and persevere, and you must prevail, you must triumph. This is what Quincy reports people in England saying to him. Not all people in England. Quincy also goes to the King's opening of Parliament. John Laurens, the gentleman in the middle, says that actually during parts of his speech, when the King talked about dangerous persons who were poisoning the minds of His Majesty's subjects, he seemed to be pointing at Josiah Quincy. Quincy was sitting close enough to the King, he said, that when the King passed by, he could have touched his scepter and robe. He did not. But here, the King is pointing to him, warning about people who are poisoning the minds of His Majesty's subjects. Quincy predicts a civil war after this. Then Parliament begins its debate as an answer to the King's speech, and the Earl of Hillsborough says that there are men walking the streets of London today who belong in Newgate or Tyburn, 2 British prisons. And when asked by another member of Parliament, who does he mean? He says, I mean Josiah Quincy and Benjamin Franklin. And Lord Chatham, the great commoner, formerly William Pitt, says he is not so much afraid of Quincy and Franklin as he is with other threats to liberty emanating from within the British government. So you have in London both a government which is eager to clamp down on a resistant colony, and it seems to Quincy and Franklin, others who are trying to preserve the standing order or preserve the liberty of Americans. Now, this, just to conclude this, Franklin, as you probably know, well, let me just back up for a minute. Benjamin Franklin goes to one of his club meetings in London sometime in the fall of 1774. And a man comes up to him and says, there's a lady I know who would like to play chess with you. Franklin was an avid chess player. In fact, he's in the Chess Hall of Fame. And he wrote a pamphlet called The Morals of Chess. And he advised the playing of chess as a way of training your mind for lots of things. So Franklin knew a lot about chess, loved to play chess. He also, to be honest, liked ladies. So hearing there was a lady who wanted to play chess should have piqued his interest, but it doesn't. And the next week, Franklin goes back to the club, and this fellow says again, there's a lady who would really like to play chess with you. Here is her address. The lady, it turns out, is Catherine Howe. And Catherine Howe was the sister of 2 fellows named Howe. One was Richard Howe, who was a British admiral, and the other is William Howe, who was a British general. And General Howe had just been elected to Parliament. He had run on a platform of opposition to a war with America. The British opposition was saying, the current administration is leading us to war with America. We want to conciliate America, not crush America. By the way, the opposition did not win the elections, but Howe was elected to Parliament. And now Howe, the 2 Howe brothers, are able to go to their sister's house. She's playing chess with Benjamin Franklin, and the chess match was really a pretext so that these 2 Howes could go and converse with Franklin about how we now can save the British Empire. Can we avert a war with America? And in fact, on Christmas of 1774, Benjamin Franklin and Catherine Howe are playing chess when her brothers, the admiral and the general, come to see if there is a way we can avert the catastrophe which we know is coming. It turns out there was not. There was not a way in 1774 that we could save what Franklin called the fragile China vase, the British Empire. And what happens next is a story we will have to come back to. Thank you. Are there questions? Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we do. We should be getting a microphone.
Okay, we'll have a microphone for those who want to ask questions, so the folks at home can hear them.
Very good. Thank you for your patience. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask?
This gentleman and this gentleman. He's trying to see if it works. Here.
Where do you get all the information from? Like from sources?
That's a good question. Where do I get all the information from? That's a good question. Where do I get all my information from? I'm not making it up. I like primary sources, and there's been a lot of the writings of most of these people have been published. So Franklin's are all published. Josiah Quincy wrote a lot. Also, the Thomas Hutchinson wrote a lot. There's an organization called the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, which publishes primary documents. You can get the big books, and your library may have them, but also we've digitized everything. So you can go to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts and read Quincy's papers and Hutchinson's papers. The National Archives is a major project on the founders' papers, so Franklin, Washington, all of those other characters are there. Newspapers are another great source. A lot of other things are in town records. Each town, when they were meeting, would have minutes. So you can probably go to the Acton town minute books and see what they were saying in Acton. And in fact, one thing we've noted, in 1776, just about every town in Massachusetts wrote out the Declaration of Independence in their town minute book. But there you can see how people were voting on things. So we want to look very locally at things and how people are making these decisions. Sometimes you have letters or diaries. Most often we don't. So gathering it from the writings of the kind of people at the top, Franklin, Hutchinson, Quincy is one way, looking at the towns is another, or looking at the newspapers, how the newspapers reported things. And a lot of the newspapers have been digitized, and you can find the Boston Public Library probably has one of the best collections of newspapers of any library in the country. There are also a number of books, secondary sources by good historians, so yeah, so that's where I get my information from. Yes, and then, well, this young lady.
When Gage was appointed governor,
Yes.
it seemed like a military man would bring more of the stick than the carrot, but it was a complex political situation.
Yes.
Would it have gone differently if it was someone other than a military man in Gage?
Okay, good question. Would it have been different if it were someone other than a military man? Gage is surprising because what Gage does not want to do is start a war. So by disarming people, he's trying to prevent a war. And that's also why in early 1775, he sends an expedition up to Salem and says, go find these cannon that have been captured, but don't start a war. Similarly, when he sends a force up to Portsmouth to get powder in December of 1774. So Gage is a military man, but he's also trying not to start a war. Similar thing will happen with Howe. It's one of the charges others in the British government will make about the Howes is the Howes are trying not simply to defeat these people, but to win back their loyalty. So how do you fight a war when you're trying to win back the loyalty of those you're fighting against? I mean, it's a conundrum. Is there, well, one idea that's been floated is when Franklin wants a different governor appointed, he wants someone who can conciliate the Americans. Maybe it was Franklin who could have done this. I don't know. It's a good question. Could someone else have averted this? Probably not. Someone other than a military person, probably not. But again, a military officer probably isn't your best choice at conciliation, but what other options do they have? Yes? That's a good question. The question is, who do I think was the most influential revolutionary writer? I'd have to say Thomas Paine. We've had all of these pamphlets and other things. James Otis wrote volumes of things. Quincy's observations on the Boston Port Bill, Joseph Warren, others. The Fairfax Resolves written by Mason and Washington. But Paine puts everything very clearly. Also, most of the other arguments had been about our charter rights and it's Parliament that is overstepping. Paine makes it about the monarch. And that destroys the idea that we can continue being governed as part of the empire if only they let us keep our assemblies in charge here. And Paine demolishes the whole idea of monarchy. So I would say Paine. Yes, young lady from Brown, yes. Which of these events is the most interesting for me to talk about? I like the way you put that because my question would be, which is the most interesting for you to hear about? I'm interested in just about everything. And So I have trouble figuring it out, what I find most interesting. It's usually the thing I hadn't heard about yet that becomes very interesting. I'm very excited about an event that happens in 1775 in May, the Battle of Chelsea Creek or Noddle's Island, which I have good for another hour on. But I'm always learning new things about all of this. So it keeps me interested, and hopefully you will find the same thing. You'll get interested in it. Do you have a particular thing you find most interesting? No, if there were going to be a final exam, that might be the question. I think you see a long train of things, and it's the way we think about them. It's not, we've heard probably more than we need to about the embattled farmers at Concord Bridge. It's this other story that's happening. As John Adams said, the revolution's happening in the minds of people. And how do you get at that story? That's one thing. And then what's the long-term significance of it? It's not simply we replace the bad guys with the good guys, but we try to create a system where, as one of these writers I just mentioned says, offices will be held by those who have the suffrage of the people, that is, the people who voted for. So it's that transition to a different kind of government that's happening here. And that's a more subtle thing. And you're certainly not going to fill a museum and get people to pay tickets to hear or see about judges' salaries or these other things that really are fundamental to the way we're thinking about government and who governs. Yes, you first?
I moved here from New York, and I remember being totally amazed. You mentioned that the governor said towns could no longer have their little town meeting, and that here in Acton, we had Crown Resistance Day.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did we meet, but we sent our grievances to Britain,
Yeah.
to the king. And I just find that fascinating. These little group of people, like, were so brave.
Yeah.
They didn't even know what the punishment was. Well, I don't
Yeah.
know what the punishment was.
Yeah, that is.
They were doing,
Yeah.
they knew their government and their way of doing
Yeah.
things locally was working.
That is. And it is different. She said she moved here from New York and was really surprised to hear about Crown Resistance Day, when despite the governor saying you can't meet, or the Crown saying you can't meet, people in Acton did and sent their grievances to the governor. We are going to continue governing ourselves the way we always have. This is really the fundamental thing here. By the way, don't do this in New York or Virginia or Pennsylvania or the other colonies. In Massachusetts, there is this tradition of self-government. And it's one of the things that changes towns. Concord, was not on board with all of the resistance in the 1760s and 1770s. Concord was happy being part of the empire because the empire left them alone. In 1774, the empire says, you can't have town meetings. And Concord says, even us? And that is what changes minds here, that now the crown is intruding into your lives. In the middle of the 19th century, early in the 19th century, an historian in one of the towns of Massachusetts finds out that there's a guy in town who had answered the alarm on April 19th. So naturally, he wants to find out what made this guy go to Concord and Lexington when he heard about the fighting. And so he goes, and being a student of history, he kind of knew the answer. So he says, I understand you answered the alarm on April 19th. This man who's now in his about 90, he says, yes, I did. He says, well, what was it? The guy says, what do you mean? He says, well, was it the Stamp Act? And the guy says, I thought the stamps never were unloaded. Well, was it the Tea Act? He said, I never drank tea. Was it the Intolerable Acts? He said, I don't know what those were. So this is the answers the historian had as to why this man had answered the alarm. And he said, well, what was it then? And the man says, we had always governed ourselves. They weren't going to let us do that anymore, and we couldn't let that happen. So that is what the call they were answering. It's that final stanza of the Concord hymn. It says, these heroes who dared to die and leave their children free. So that's really this choice they're making. This young lady in the back.
So I'm intrigued by your comment that in Britain, in England, they said, we can't be free here under a monarch unless the Americans are, or unless the colonies are free. If the idea of the colonies being free from the monarchy, how does that make England free under the monarchy?
That's a very good question. I hope everyone could hear it. You know, people in England saying we can't be free if liberty. Remember, Parliament is the great liberty-protecting body in the world. In the 1680s, there is a revolution, what the English call the Glorious Revolution, when Parliament ousts the king, King James II. And then Parliament summons a new monarch. Actually, James's daughter, Mary, and her husband, William, who come to be King William and Queen Mary. And they have to agree to a list of things. So think about it. When Parliament is both firing the monarch and hiring a new monarch and telling the new monarch what the rules are, who's running things in England? Parliament. Yeah. So the crown, by this time, is not quite a figurehead, but very much so. And in the 18th century, there's an understanding that the crown isn't going to meddle in political affairs. The problem King George III has is he's imbibed a lot of Enlightenment ideas about being a patriot king. So actually does want to meddle in political affairs. But our thinking is Parliament really should be the liberty-loving body. We love the Magna Carta, and in fact, in most of the patriot propaganda, you'll see Magna Carta featured. It's on that silver bowl that Paul Revere makes for the Sons of Liberty. It's everywhere. So we are upholding the traditional rights of people of England. And Parliament is now usurping that. Parliament's saying, hey, we're the body that runs things. Why shouldn't we? It's somewhat of a complicated issue, but it's not that complicated that people here can't understand it. And by the way, in England, as I said, there is an opposition in Parliament to these various policies. You know, one of the things that challenges us in England is you cannot criticize the king. You can criticize the king's ministers. But at this time, when Gage arrives, and Gage has an army here, they call these the ministerial troops. Not the king's troops, the ministerial troops. That is the king's ministers. And in Parliament, there is certainly an idea that it is these policies of the North administration, and North is supported by the Crown, and North is supporting the Crown, that are bringing on the crisis. And Parliament is overstepping. Parliament is intruding on liberty. And what we as opposition members of Parliament have to do is turn out this crowd and get in a new crowd. And in fact, there are lots of things wrong with Parliament, the way it's structured. And in 1779 or 1780, one of the opposition members points out to the other members of Parliament that America is going to bring down your rotten system. Because Americans are saying we want taxation without no taxation without representation. Most people in England are not represented in Parliament. Members of Parliament do not represent a district. They are supposed to represent the good of the empire. That's what they're supposed to be thinking about. And there are lots of places in England that don't have a representative in Parliament. In fact, the members of Parliament are not called representatives, they're members. And Parliament had been created sometime between 1100 and 1300. By the way, this is a long story about the history of Parliament, but there were places that have a member of Parliament because they were important places in 1100 or 1300. They now don't have any population. So who is their member? Someone the Prime Minister appoints. And then there are other places that hadn't existed in 1100 or 1300, which now do. Places like Bristol, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, big parts of London. Big populations, but no member. So they're not represented. So for for members of Parliament, this idea that you cannot be taxed unless you're represented is nonsense, because lots of people in England are taxed who aren't represented. But what happens in England in the wake of the American Revolution is a challenge to that very idea. That, yeah, representation is something we need. And so that's why in the 19th century you have a big movement in England to reform Parliament and do away with what are called the rotten boroughs and other things. So it's a connection here. And the Americans are also drawing a connection with the English radicals. I'm good for about another 2 hours on this subject, but I think we might one more question. Yes.
Yeah, so the British didn't rule the world by being nice.
No.
But let's assume here, if they were nicer to the colonies, would the revolution have occurred anyway? And would that number maybe be 200 or 150 instead of 250?
That's a very good question. We'll leave aside the niceness of the people of England or the British government. Quite likely, in 1770, well, by the way, one thing the British could have done, Americans keep gassing on about wanting representation. Okay, we'll give them representatives in Parliament. There are about 450 members of Parliament. So suppose there are 13 Americans. They're represented. Will they have any grounds for complaining? That would have cut out their whole argument. In 1778, the British government does send a commission, this is in the midst of the war, again, the opposition says to the ministry in power, boy, you've really botched this, the war's going badly, so we'll send a commission to try to patch things up. And what they're going to offer is essentially what would have stopped the whole thing in 1774. We won't tax you without your consent. Your governors won't be, you can have your town meetings. You can do all of these other things. We'll rescind all of these bad laws that you say brought on the trouble. So they come here and say, hey, this is what we're ready to do. Well, by this time, the Americans say, well, that's not going to work now. We want to be independent now. So, yeah, they could have, I won't say if they were nicer, but maybe if they were smarter. Which is why Franklin and the House are meeting in 1774 to see, is there a way to avert this? It turns out there is not, and to be honest and concise, the real reason it wasn't was the king didn't want to budge on this. Because if he gives in to the Americans, what will he have to concede to Ireland or Liverpool or Birmingham or these other places? So it's true, as the British were saying, the cause of America is the cause of liberty, and that is something the British government was coming to realize too late. So thank you.